On the eve of battle, American soldiers were handed a curious item alongside their rifles, rations, and helmets, a small packet containing a condom. At first glance, it seemed trivial, even laughable. Yet for the US Army, this little piece of rubber was as strategic as a bullet or a bandage. It meant fewer sick days, fewer lost men, and an army that could keep moving without being crippled by invisible enemies. Across the front lines, German troops marched into the same war with no such safeguard in their pockets. Instead, they were bound by the state's iron grip over sexuality, directed into military-regulated brothels subject to inspections, or left with nothing at all. While American soldiers joked about the army's obsession with pro-kits, German soldiers often faced the grim reality of untreated infections, shortages, and a command more interested in ideology than practicality. The contrast was stark. One side embraced prevention, pragmatism, and science. The other trusted rules, discipline, and control. As the war dragged on, this invisible difference would quietly decide who could fight longer, harder, and without interruption. How could a small, ordinary object carry such extraordinary weight? And why did Axis soldiers, proud and hardened, find themselves stunned at the sheer practicality of America's approach? This is the untold story of how a thin sheet of rubber helped shape the outcome of World War II. World War II is often remembered in images of tanks rolling across Europe, fleets of ships spanning the horizon, and bombers darkening the skies. Yet behind the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines lay another quieter battlefield, one fought not with bullets but with microbes, not with tanks but with human bodies. It was a war within the war, the struggle against venereal disease. The lessons of World War I weighed heavily on military planners. In the Great War, sexually transmitted infections had ravaged armies on both sides. For the United States, over 4,000,000 cases of syphilis and gonorrhea were recorded, and at certain points these diseases sidelined more soldiers than enemy bullets. The US Army calculated that more than 7 million days of service were lost to venereal disease during that conflict. This was a logistical disaster, a silent plague that drained manpower and crippled combat effectiveness. The Germans, French, and British had experienced similar losses, but the Americans entering the war relatively late had been particularly stung by the scale of the problem. The conclusion was clear: in the next war, prevention would be as important as ammunition. By the 1932, as tensions simmered once again in Europe and Asia, the US military began reshaping its policies. Rather than leaning solely on moral exhortations or punishment, the Army Medical Department chose a different path: education and prevention. Training manuals included entire sections on sex, hygiene, and venereal disease. Posters plastered barracks and camps with slogans like, "You can't beat the Axis if you get VD," and "A soldier with syphilis is a soldier for Hitler." These messages, delivered with the bluntness typical of American wartime propaganda, left no room for ambiguity. Disease was an enemy, and prevention was a soldier's duty. Alongside this educational push came a practical solution: the condom. By the late 1932, the US Army had begun issuing prophylactic kits, often referred to simply as pro-kits, to its men. These contained condoms and chemical disinfectants, and they were distributed with the same matter-of-fact regularity as ammunition or rations. The underlying philosophy was pragmatic. Young men far from home and under constant stress were unlikely to abstain. Rather than moralize, the military sought to manage the reality. The contrast with Germany could not have been greater. Under the Nazi regime, sexuality was tightly bound to ideology. The state preached purity, and racial health and contraception was often restricted or stigmatized. Instead of empowering individual soldiers with preventive tools, the Wehrmacht centralized sexual health through regulated military brothels. These establishments were controlled, inspected, and sometimes staffed with coerced women from occupied territories. Soldiers were expected to follow rules, submit to regular medical checks, and trust the system. Condoms were present in this framework, but they were tied to the brothel system rather than handed out as a personal safeguard. In practice, this meant that many frontline soldiers had no ready access to protection during long deployments. As the war expanded across continents, these differences grew sharper. In American camps, prophylactic stations were as common as mess halls. After a night in town, a soldier could report to a pro station, receive chemical treatment, and be cleared for duty within hours. Condoms were available not only through issue but also through base exchanges and even vending machines in certain locations. By 1943, with the arrival of penicillin in the US, Army possessed a layered defense condoms and education to prevent infection, rapid treatment stations to catch early cases, and antibiotics to cure the stubborn ones. Germany, by contrast, struggled to maintain its rigid system as the war dragged on. Shortages of rubber constrained the production of condoms. The collapse of supply lines meant that brothels were often abandoned or fell into disarray as fronts shifted. The emphasis on discipline rather than prevention left German soldiers vulnerable. Reports from the Eastern Front describe high rates of syphilis and gonorrhea, spreading among units straining already overextended medical services. Even where condoms were technically available, distribution was uneven and inconsistent. The Reich's obsession with ideology and control had blinded it to the practical soldier-level measures that its adversary had already normalized. Statistics bear out the results of these divergent approaches. In World War I, American troops had lost tens of thousands of men days each week to venereal disease. By the height of World War II, with condoms, pro-kits, and penicillin widely used, the rate of infection among US soldiers had dropped to about 37 to 43 cases per 1,000 men per year. The Army calculated that in 1944, despite millions of troops overseas, only about 606 men were out of action on any given day due to venereal disease, a staggering 30-fold improvement over the First World War. This was not just a health statistic, it was a measure of combat readiness. Meanwhile, German records reveal that venereal disease remained a persistent and growing problem, particularly in occupied territories where the brothel system broke down or became chaotic. Medical officers debated policy, some pushing for more widespread distribution of condoms, others clinging to the ideological emphasis on racial purity and controlled prostitution. The result was inconsistency and inefficiency. As the Wehrmacht reeled from defeats on the Eastern Front and later in Western Europe, it could ill afford the additional drain of thousands of men sidelined by preventable infections. This was the backdrop against which American and German soldiers faced each other, one army equipped not only with tanks and planes but also with prophylactics and penicillin, the other relying on rigid structures that faltered under the weight of global war. The American approach was blunt, unashamed, and profoundly effective. The German system was rigid, ideological, and ultimately self-defeating. In this hidden battlefield, the United States gained an invisible but decisive edge. A soldier with a condom in his pocket was a soldier available for tomorrow's fight. And in a war where manpower and momentum were everything, that small advantage multiplied into a massive strategic difference. When the United States entered World War II, its generals and medical officers carried with them a hard-earned lesson from the Great War. Soldiers, sidelined by venereal disease, were as dangerous to an army's strength as enemy artillery. From the very start, American planners determined that history would not repeat itself. They resolved to treat sexual health not as a shameful side issue, but as a frontline matter of military readiness. The American approach was built on several pillars, each reinforcing the other. The first was education. Every new recruit, from basic training onward, encountered blunt, sometimes shocking lectures on the dangers of venereal disease. Posters loomed over barracks walls with headlines like, "Don't take a chance with VD or you can't fight if you're sick." Leaflets were slipped into mess kits and pockets, spelling out in plain language the consequences of untreated infection. American commanders wanted to leave no illusions. Sexually transmitted disease was an enemy. Soldier could not see but one capable of crippling entire battalions if left unchecked. The second pillar was personal prevention. Unlike Germany, which tried to control sexuality through rules and supervised brothels, the US armed forces trusted soldiers to take responsibility when given the right tools. Hence the prophylactic kit, or simply pro-kit. Issued widely, it contained condoms and chemical disinfectants. Soldiers joked about the kits, some even rolling their eyes at the Army's obsession with rubbers. But in practice, the pro-kit became as common in a man's pocket as his field dressing or mess kit. There was no mystery in their purpose. Commanders openly discussed them during training. Instruction sheets carefully explained how to use them. At bases around the world, condoms were sold cheaply at post exchanges, stocked in dispensers, or handed out at medical stations. The language was frank: if you can't be good, be careful. For a military steeped in the no-nonsense culture of logistics, this was simply another supply problem. Keeping rifles clean, keeping trucks fueled, and keeping men free of syphilis were all matters of readiness. The third pillar was the prophylactic station, a unique American innovation. Scattered across camps and bases, these stations were open late into the night, sometimes around the clock. Soldiers returning from town could stop and undergo quick chemical treatment and return to duty. Though the process was not pleasant, it drastically reduced infection rates. Medical officers kept detailed records, tracing trends, adjusting resources, and pushing their men to take advantage of the facilities. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the American system was how pragmatism overshadowed stigma. In many societies at the time, speaking openly about sex was taboo, yet the U.S. military, faced with the cold mathematics of manpower, brushed aside moral objections. Chaplains might urge abstinence, but the army ensured that every man had access to condoms. This dual approach, moral encouragement paired with practical backup, meant that the message reached every kind of soldier. And then came the fourth pillar, penicillin. By 1943, this wonder drug had begun to flow from American factories in quantities unimaginable to other nations. For centuries, syphilis and gonorrhea had plagued armies without mercy, leaving scars, blindness, and madness in their wake. Now, at last, there was a cure that worked swiftly and decisively. Experiments on servicemen showed cure rates of over 90% for gonorrhea. By late 1944, penicillin was standard issue in field hospitals and naval infirmaries. Soldiers who once might have been laid up for weeks could now return to duty in days. The effect on morale was profound. Troops who knew that treatment existed were more willing to report symptoms early rather than hiding them in fear of punishment. Commanders praised the drug as a miracle that preserved fighting strength. Even the Navy, which had once maintained entire departments to manage social diseases, began to close them down as penicillin reduced cases to a trickle. There were even curious side stories. Soldiers found alternative uses for their condoms, covering the muzzle of a rifle to keep out mud, protecting the barrel of a machine gun from rain, even waterproofing a pack of cigarettes. These anecdotes, half humorous, half practical, reveal how deeply integrated the condom had become in the American soldier's kit. What had once been a symbol of moral controversy was now just another piece of equipment as ordinary as a canteen or compass. By the middle of the war, statistics told the story. In World War I, the U.S. Army had been hemorrhaging manpower to venereal disease. In World War II, thanks to education, prophylactic kits, pro-stations, and penicillin, the rate of infection had plummeted to about 43 cases per 1,000 men per year. The Army calculated that on any given day, only about 600 men were sidelined by these illnesses, a staggering reduction compared to the tens of thousands in 1918. The lesson was unmistakable: the United States had turned sexual health into a logistical triumph. Its soldiers, far from home and tempted by the freedoms of foreign ports, were nonetheless shielded by layers of protection. The contrast with their enemies could not have been sharper. For the Americans, a small packet of rubber and a vial of penicillin had become weapons in their own right, silent, invisible weapons that preserved divisions, sustained offensives, and helped ensure that when the time came, the army was ready to fight. In the great clash of nations, it was not only steel and firepower that decided outcomes. It was also the quiet efficiency of a military willing to embrace pragmatism over ideology. And in that hidden battle, the American way proved devastatingly effective. If the American system was pragmatic, blunt, and rooted in prevention, the German approach to venereal disease during World War II was shaped by ideology, hierarchy, and control. The Nazi state prided itself on discipline and racial hygiene, and this attitude extended deep into the sexual lives of its soldiers. The result was a system that looked rigorous on paper but cracked under the stresses of global war. The foundation of the Wehrmacht's sexual health strategy was the military brothel system known as Wehrmacht's bordel. From France to Poland, Norway to the Balkans, German occupation authorities established hundreds of such institutions. Soldiers were encouraged, or in many cases required to use them, rather than seek sexual encounters independently. The reasoning was twofold. First, by concentrating activity in a controlled space, medical staff could conduct regular inspections and reduce the risk of disease. Second, it gave the regime a way to enforce its ideology of racial control, since brothels were segregated by nationality and race. German soldiers were often restricted to certain women deemed racially acceptable, while other groups were either barred or coerced into separate facilities. On the surface, this system seemed efficient. Medical officers tested the women, frequently treating or discarding those found infected. Soldiers had to present papers, sometimes even stamped cards, to gain entry. In theory, this created a closed loop of regulated sexuality. But the reality was far messier. The rapid expansion of the German war machine, combined with the brutal occupation of vast territories, made consistent regulation nearly impossible. Shortages of staff, corruption, and the sheer demand from millions of troops stretched the system to its breaking point. One major flaw was the inconsistent distribution of condoms. Unlike in the American military, where condoms were placed directly in soldiers' hands, the German approach tied them to the brothel system. Condoms were available inside these establishments, but they were not routinely issued as a standard part of a soldier's kit. In some cases, troops had to purchase them privately, and supplies fluctuated wildly due to wartime shortages of rubber. Germany, cut off from many global supply chains, struggled to produce enough high-quality condoms to keep up with demand. By the later years of the war, access was often unreliable. Moreover, the regime's obsession with racial and moral ideology often clashed with medical necessity. The Nazis viewed contraception with suspicion, fearing it would encourage promiscuity or undermine population growth. While the Wehrmacht permitted condoms in its brothels, broader state policy restricted their advertisement and sale in civilian life. This created a paradox. Soldiers were expected to remain healthy, yet the tools to ensure that health were never fully normalized. Commanders often preferred to lecture troops about self-control and discipline rather than distribute practical protection. The consequences were predictable. Reports from the Eastern Front, where German soldiers often operated far from organized brothels, show alarming rates of syphilis and gonorrhea. In occupied Soviet territories, the situation was worse. Desperate conditions, exploitation of local populations, and collapsing medical infrastructure made the spread of disease almost inevitable. Medical officers complained of rising infections, yet systemic change rarely came. Instead, the solution was often punishment. Soldiers caught with venereal disease faced disciplinary measures, including confinement, loss of pay, or humiliation. Fear of punishment led many to hide their symptoms, worsening the spread. Even within the official brothel system, control often proved illusory. The sheer number of soldiers cycling through the coercion of women under duress and the inevitable black markets that sprang up meant that infections still circulated widely. By 1943, as the tide of war turned against Germany, the system grew more chaotic. Retreats and advances disrupted supply chains, medical inspections became inconsistent, and many brothels collapsed altogether. Soldiers left to their own devices frequently engaged with local populations without any protection, accelerating transmission. What made this even more damaging was the German state's insistence on secrecy and denial. Whereas the Americans openly addressed venereal disease with posters, lectures, and medical campaigns, German authorities treated it as a shameful subject. Official propaganda rarely mentioned the issue, and soldiers were discouraged from speaking openly about it. This silence created a culture of stigma. Men who fell ill often delayed reporting symptoms, allowing infections to spread. By the time they sought treatment, complications were severe, leading to longer hospital stays and more men removed from combat duty. There were also significant contradictions in policy. On one hand, the regime demanded racial purity and punished fraternization with undesirable groups. On the other, it quietly tolerated or even encouraged regulated prostitution as a necessary evil to maintain morale. The result was confusion and hypocrisy that undermined confidence in the system. For many soldiers, the rules felt arbitrary and burdensome, and compliance weakened over time. By comparison to the US figures, the German system performed poorly. While American infection rates dropped dramatically during the war, the Wehrmacht continued to wrestle with stubbornly high numbers. Exact statistics remain debated, but German medical records and post-war studies suggest that venereal disease was a persistent problem, draining manpower, just as the Reich needed it most. Medical officers themselves admitted in reports that the system of brothels was insufficient, and some even called for broader condom distribution. But ideological resistance and logistical shortages prevented any real reform. This rigid, top-down approach revealed a deeper truth about the Nazi war machine. Just as Germany struggled to match American industrial output in tanks, ships, and planes, it also faltered in the less glamorous realm of sexual health logistics. Where the Americans embraced practicality, handing out condoms, establishing pro-stations, and embracing penicillin, the Germans clung to ideology and control. The difference was invisible on the battlefield in the short term, but over time it shaped the readiness of entire divisions. A German soldier stricken with syphilis was not just a personal casualty. He represented a broken link in the chain of command, a missing rifle in the line, an extra burden on already strained medical services. Multiply that by tens of thousands and the impact became strategic. As one medical officer later admitted, venereal disease in the Wehrmacht was a silent drain on fighting strength. By the final years of the war, the contrast could not have been starker. American troops carried prophylactics in their packs, backed by miracle drugs and a culture of prevention. German troops, bound by rules, stigma, and shortages, too often marched unprotected into both battle and illness. The result was yet another hidden front, where ideology failed and pragmatism prevailed. By 1944, the war in Europe had reached its most decisive phase. The Allies were preparing for the colossal gamble of D-Day, and every soldier counted. In this moment, the invisible war over venereal disease reached its own climax. For the Americans, years of investment in prevention and treatment paid off spectacularly. For the Germans, their rigid ideology-driven system began to collapse under the weight of retreat and shortages. In England, as hundreds of thousands of US soldiers assembled for Operation Overlord, military planners feared an outbreak of disease could cripple the force before it even landed in Normandy. The solution was relentless preparation. Posters in camps reminded men daily, "Don't risk it. You're needed for D-Day." Condoms were distributed in massive quantities, tucked into rations, sold in post-exchanges, and even placed in dispensers at pubs near staging areas. Prophylactic stations multiplied, ensuring that if a soldier did take a risk, he could report for treatment with no questions asked. The message was crystal clear: stay healthy because the invasion depends on you. Meanwhile, across the Channel, German soldiers awaited the Allied storm. Their commanders faced the opposite situation. Brothel systems, already strained, were breaking down as Allied bombing severed supply lines and medical inspections faltered. In occupied France, many regulated establishments closed or fell under chaotic local control. Soldiers who sought relief were left with inconsistent access to protection. Reports from German medical officers reveal increasing frustration. Infections were spreading faster than they could be contained, yet resources were dwindling, and commanders still resisted large-scale condom distribution. When D-Day finally came on the 6th of June 1944, the difference in readiness was striking. The Americans landed in Normandy with divisions at full strength. There was no hidden epidemic undermining their momentum. The men who stormed Omaha and Utah beaches had been kept fighting, fit by a system that treated venereal disease as a logistical enemy to be crushed. It was not just rifles and rations that powered the assault, it was also the quiet success of prevention. In the months that followed, as the Allies pushed across France and toward Germany, the disparity only grew. Penicillin, by then produced in industrial volumes by American factories, flowed into field hospitals and mobile clinics. Soldiers struck by gonorrhea could return to duty within days. Syphilis, once a long-term scourge, was rapidly cured. The Army Medical Department celebrated penicillin as a miracle that restored entire battalions to fighting strength. For the Germans, retreat meant collapse. On the Eastern Front, as the Red Army advanced westward, medical services disintegrated. Brothels were abandoned, records destroyed, inspections forgotten. German soldiers, often cut off from organized care, turned to local encounters without protection. Disease rates spiked, worsening already dire manpower shortages. Some divisions reported entire companies sidelined by illness. Military doctors pleaded for supplies, but Germany's crippled industry could no longer deliver. Rubber was scarce antibiotics, virtually non-existent, and ideology still shackled the system to rules that had long since ceased to function. The difference was visible not only in statistics but also in morale. American troops knew they had a safety net. If they slipped, there was treatment. If they needed protection, it was available. This knowledge, combined with the astonishing effectiveness of penicillin, gave them confidence. German troops, by contrast, lived with the fear of both disease and punishment. Infection meant not just sickness but also shame, discipline, and time away from the front, with little chance of rapid recovery. By late 1944, the results spoke for themselves. In the US, Army only about 606 men per day were rendered ineffective by venereal disease, a fraction of the tens of thousands during World War I. In the Wehrmacht, the numbers remained stubbornly high, though censored reports tried to conceal the extent of the problem. What could not be hidden was the drain on fighting strength, especially at a time when every rifle was desperately needed to resist the Allied advance. The climax of this hidden war came in 1945 as the Allies crossed the Rhine. For the Americans, venereal disease had ceased to be a major concern. Preventive systems functioned smoothly, and penicillin mopped up the remaining cases. For the Germans, the system had collapsed entirely. Brothels closed, supplies vanished, and medical staff struggled to cope with waves of sick and retreating soldiers. The Reich's once strict controls dissolved into chaos, mirroring the broader collapse of the German war effort. This contrast, one side ascending through science and pragmatism, the other descending into disorder and ideology, was more than a footnote. It symbolized the broader truth of the war. The United States, with its industrial might and practical mindset, turned even the smallest detail into an advantage. Germany, blinded by ideology and crippled by shortages, could not adapt. Thus, in the very moment when armies clashed in the greatest battles of the 20th century, another battle was quietly decided in clinics, in pro-stations, and in the humble condom packets stuffed into American uniforms. It was a battle of readiness, and in that contest, the Americans achieved total victory. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world tried to take stock of the most destructive conflict in human history. Victory had come at enormous cost, yet within the rubble and statistics lay a lesson as surprising as it was profound. The fight against venereal disease had been one of the quiet triumphs of the American war machine. A tiny, almost laughable object, the condom, had helped preserve fighting strength, while an invisible ally, penicillin, had restored the sick to health with miraculous speed. The numbers spoke volumes. During World War I, the US Army had lost millions of man-days to venereal disease. It was so severe that in some weeks more soldiers were in hospital with syphilis or gonorrhea than were wounded by enemy fire. In World War II, thanks to the preventive system of pro-kits, prophylactic stations, and penicillin, the daily loss was cut to just over 600 men. For an army of millions, this was negligible, barely a scratch on the vast machine of war. The contrast was staggering. America had turned one of its greatest weaknesses into a near non-issue. For the Germans, the aftermath was sobering. Post-war studies revealed how poorly their system had performed. Reliant on brothels, bound by ideology and crippled by shortages, the Wehrmacht had failed to control venereal disease effectively. Thousands of soldiers were lost to sickness at crucial moments, straining a military already fighting for survival. German medical officers admitted sometimes bitterly that broader condom distribution and preventive measures might have preserved precious manpower. But under the Nazi regime, practicality had too often been sacrificed for ideology. The broader implications were enormous. The American approach to sexual health during the war became a model for future militaries. By normalizing the distribution of condoms, by treating sexual health as part of readiness rather than as a moral weakness, the US armed forces had broken a cultural taboo. This pragmatism spilled over into civilian life in the post-war years. Public health campaigns against syphilis gained momentum. The stigma around prophylactics began to fade, and condoms slowly emerged as accepted tools of prevention, not shame. Penicillin, meanwhile, revolutionized medicine, saving millions of lives beyond the battlefield. There was also a symbolic meaning. The war had been in many ways a clash between pragmatism and ideology. On the battlefield, America's tanks, ships, and planes overwhelmed Germany's dwindling resources. Behind the lines, America's willingness to embrace practicality, whether in logistics, production, or sexual health, proved decisive. The condom became a metaphor for the American way of war, simple, effective, mass-produced, and utterly unromantic but devastatingly reliable. This hidden war also shaped the memory of soldiers themselves. Many veterans later recalled the frank lectures, the posters, and the little pro-kits stuffed into their packs. Some laughed about them, others rolled their eyes, but all understood the reasoning. For many, it was their first encounter with a system that treated sexual health with such blunt honesty. In contrast, German veterans spoke of secrecy, punishment, and fear, an environment where disease carried shame as well as pain. The legacy continued long after 1945. The U.S. military maintained its pragmatic policies, embedding sexual health into standard training and logistics. By the Korean War and Vietnam, condoms and antibiotics were again standard tools of readiness. In civilian life, the lessons of wartime prevention campaigns influenced public health for decades. Posters warning about venereal disease in 1944 were replaced by campaigns about family planning, then HIV divided by AIDS in the 1,980 seconds, but the lineage was clear. The war had normalized the idea that prevention was as important as treatment, and that frankness was more effective than silence. In the end, the story of condoms in World War II is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder that wars are not only won by tanks and bombers, but also by the quiet victories of science, medicine, and logistics. It is a story about how a democratic nation, unashamed to embrace practicality, could outlast an enemy trapped by its own rigid ideology. And it is a story about how even the smallest objects, a packet of rubber, a vial of medicine, can help decide the fate of nations. The Germans, with their obsession for control and purity, could not believe how bluntly the Americans armed their soldiers with such tools. For them, it was shocking, almost obscene. But for the Americans, it was simple. A soldier who was healthy could fight. A soldier who was sick could not. That was the beginning and the end of the calculation. Thus, the legacy of this hidden war endures. In the shadows of Normandy, in the dust of North Africa, in the mud of the Ardennes, countless battles were shaped not just by artillery, but by the unseen advantage of prevention. The condom, the prostation, the syringe of penicillin, these were the quiet allies that helped carry the United States to victory. And so when we look back at World War II, we should remember not only the thunder of guns, but also the silence of diseases that never spread, the men who never fell sick, and the divisions that never lost their strength. In that silence lies one of America's most unlikely triumphs, the day a little strip of rubber became a weapon of war.